Thank you so much for joining us for CBN Newswatch. I'm Ephraim Graham. Ahead today, spiritual leaders, political leaders, as well as leaders from Israel and CBN's own reporters remembering CBN founder Pat Robertson after his death Thursday at the age of 93.
Pat Robertson invested in other people, in other ministries. A lot of people don't do that.
He was the salt of the earth. That's what the Bible said we were supposed to be, to go into all the world, not just all the church, and influence the way the world thinks.
The ability he had to bring people in, to remind them about the love of God, and to make them understand that there was a path for every person in their life was extraordinary.
It was Pat Robertson and the evangelical communities who revered him, that kept support for Israel and our economy going through those very dark days. We owe him an historic debt.
One of the things that always struck me about Pat was his love of the news.
When I think about Pat, I think about how he listened to God. He was always listening to God.
Now, these leaders and more honoring Dr. Pat Robertson on the special edition of CBN Newswatch.
This is CBN Newswatch.
I want to begin this half hour today with tributes from spiritual leaders flooding in for Dr. Pat Robertson. Many are remembering the faithful broadcaster for his wisdom and commitment to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ. They're also sharing how Pat's vision for Christian television has impacted the world for years to come. Charlene Aaron has this story.
Lee Webb, the 700 Club news anchor for 19 years, remembers Pat as a visionary who loved God.
Everything he did, he had that passion for excellence. I think it's incorrect to say that Pat produced Christian television. He wanted to produce excellence in television that was Christian. His zeal and that passion was contagious for all of us who had the great privilege and honor of working for him and with him.
Former 700 Club co-host Sheila Walsh.
He was like a father to me. You know, I lost my dad when I was 5, through some of the most difficult years in my life, when I was struggling with my own diagnosis of clinical depression, I found Pat to be the most compassionate, loving, and supportive person.
That influence extending beyond the CBN family.
Pat Robertson invested in other people, in other ministries. A lot of people don't do that.
Bishop T.D. Jakes says with all that Pat accomplished, sharing the gospel was paramount.
He was the salt of the earth. That's what the Bible said we were supposed to be, to go into all the world, not just all the church, and influence the way the world thinks. Our country is better because of Dr. Pat Robertson.
Pastor Jack Graham saw Pat as a happy warrior who tackled key topics.
He took on all the issues of our times, the important biblical and cultural issues. He stood strongly for the sanctity of life, which is near and dear to the hearts of so many of us. And he was always willing to put his faith in action.
Action that included a strong vision for taking the gospel around the world. And for that, former U.S. Ambassador for Religious Freedom Sam Brownback calls him a true champion.
Unmatched, unparalleled. He really opened up a number of places, and he was, again, a pioneer there with all of the broadcasting that he in various iterations and groups has been associated with taking the good news around the world.
Good news that is sure to be remembered and rewarded.
The passing of Pat Robertson sure made heaven richer, sure left earth poorer. A dear man, visionary, a man of deep faith, pioneering spirit, courageous.
He definitely is one of the most transformative Christian leaders, not just of our lifetime, but in the past few hundred years.
As Paul said, you know, I fought the good fight, I kept the faith, I finished the course. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give to me that day, not to me only, but to all who love his appearing. I have no doubt that Pat is receiving that reward and has heard Jesus say to him, well done, good and faithful servant.
So heaven's gates were open to him, but I also think he had an abundant entrance. And you look at the things he did and what he's left behind, and surely the angels stood up to applaud him as he walked through the gates.
Charlene Aaron, CBN News.
Before we move on with our special tribute to Pat Robertson, we want to mention an important story in today's headline. As widely expected, former President Donald Trump has been indicted by the Justice Department on charges of mishandling classified documents at his Florida estate. It is the first time a former president has been indicted by the federal government, Trump calling the indictment a hoax.
I'm innocent, and we will prove that very, very soundly and hopefully very quickly.
The FBI seized more than 100 documents with classified markings from Trump's estate last year. The indictment carries potentially serious legal consequences, including the possibility of prison if he's convicted. Republican leaders, including Trump's presidential rival, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, say the federal justice system has been turned into a weapon against the former president. Coming up, we're going to hear from U.S. political leaders and top political leaders in Pat's home state of Virginia about his amazing life. We've got the story for you when we come back. Stay with us. Reaction to the passing of Pat Robertson poured in from top leaders in Washington as they look back at his life and his impact on America's political scene. CBN's Jenna Browder brings us that story now from Washington.
Pat Robertson's impact on politics in Washington goes back almost 50 years. In addition to interviewing presidents and running for the office, Pat encouraged people of faith to get involved and make a difference. Now our nation's top leaders are grieving his loss and celebrating his amazing legacy.
Pat Robertson impacted America and our world for our values like few other Americans ever have.
From Mike Pence to Nikki Haley.
The ability he had to bring people in, to remind them about the love of God, and to make them understand that there was a path for every person in their life was extraordinary.
The political world is remembering Pat, many calling him a friend, and noting his mark on people and politics. Former President Trump calling him an incredible and powerful voice for faith and freedom. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis tweeting he and his wife are saddened by the loss. And on Capitol Hill,
just proud to call him a friend. And the thing I admired most, he was a strong Ronald Reagan Republican conservative on national defense, and Israel had no better friend.
People see him as a commentator, as a media person, as all these different things on it. But first, he was a dad and a grandfather and a husband and a pastor, and he just maintained that heart. His great love for people just came through.
Pat had a strength that no matter what challenges faced America, faced the world, that he rested comfortably in the strength and love of his Savior.
What an impact he had on this country, and he will be missed, but he will be remembered very fondly.
All agreeing the world has lost a giant of faith and politics.
We express our deepest sympathies in our prayers, but we know that America is poorer, but heaven is richer. God bless Pat Robertson.
In Washington, Jenna Browder, CBN News.
Another well-known political leader also honoring Pat Robertson's legacy, former Arkansas governor and Republican presidential candidate Mike Huckabee. A strong Christian himself, spoke of Pat's faith and his ministry.
What impressed me about Pat was the authenticity of his own personal faith, the genuine, humble, kind spirit that one saw in him. But what a lot of the public never saw was an extraordinarily entrepreneurial, business-savvy guy who took this fledgling idea of a Christian television network and turned it into something of global significance.
And as others have said, Huckabee added he believes that when Pat entered heaven, God told him, "Well done, good and faithful servant." For Pat, it all began in Virginia from the moment CBN went on the air from a small station in Portsmouth, Virginia, to the founding of Regent University and Operation Blessing. Virginia has played an integral part of Pat's vision for global evangelism. George Thomas brings us that story.
I'll tell you what, the man is an icon. He's part of the DNA of this great city.
Every day is a good day to be in Virginia Beach, isn't it?
Virginia Beach Mayor Bobby Dyer says Pat's decision to plant CBN and other organizations, including Operation Blessing and Regent University, has been a continual blessing to the city.
You know, I think in some ways, CBN and Regent are one of the best kept secrets.
Dyer, who says he's known Pat for over 30 years, is in awe that 62 years after CBN sent out its first television signal from that small UHF station in Portsmouth, that the ministry continues to influence people in his city and around the world.
When you think about right here in Virginia Beach, the impact this man and his organization had on the entire world, not just our great country, but the entire world, through Operation Blessing and the many, many good things that a lot of people didn't know that Pat Robertson did for so many people.
In 1977, Pat founded CBN University, later named Regent University, to equip Christian leaders to change the world. It's become one of the leading institutions of higher learning in the state and the country. Former Congressman Randy Forbes says the history of Regent is a testament to Pat's commitment to excellence, innovation, and integrity.
This is a place where people who believe and have faith like Pat's can come and thrive and also realize they can bring excellence to everything that they do.
Regent University started with 77 students and today boasts some 37,000 alumni, serving in key leadership roles around the world. Forbes says Pat's obedience to build an institution for the Lord's glory is one of his lasting legacies.
The Lord blessed Pat in doing that, but you also have to realize Pat was faithful and committed, and he sold out everything he had to make sure he was being obedient to the Lord, and this is the fruits of it.
Pat, really set a very high standard, and I tell you what, he's going to be missed, but he's going to be remembered, and his legacy will continue by the good acts that people do living here in Virginia Beach, this Commonwealth, this nation, and this world.
George Thomas, CBN News.
Still ahead, we're going to take you to Israel to hear from top figures in the Israeli government and Christian leaders as well, as they reflect on the importance of Pat's long and steadfast support for the Jewish state. We're going to bring you that story from Jerusalem right after this. One of Pat Robertson's greatest legacies was his steadfast stand with the state of Israel and the Jewish people. Chris Mitchell brings us this story now from Jerusalem on the reaction to Pat's death from Israeli and Christian leaders.
Former Israeli ambassador to the U.S., Michael Oren, a frequent guest on the 700 Club, remembers how Pat stood with Israel.
We're talking about support for Israel during some of our hardest times, support for Israel's right to defend itself, our right to exist as a Jewish state. I remember during the dark days of the Second Intifada, 2000 to 2004, 2005, when there were no tourists in the state of Israel, the hotels were empty, the flights were empty. It was Pat Robertson and the evangelical communities who revered him that kept support for Israel and our economy going through those very dark days. We owe him an historic debt.
In 1974 in the Mount of Olives, Pat vowed to the Lord he would always stand with Israel and the Jewish people.
He certainly kept his vow to the Lord, and we are the grateful recipients.
Jerusalem Deputy Mayor Flor Hassan Nahum remembers Pat's friendship and love for the city of Jerusalem.
We had no better friends than leaders like Pat Robertson for the city of Jerusalem, for advocating for the embassy move, for advocating for the full recognition of Jerusalem as a capital city of the state of Israel and the Jewish people. He saw us as no less than a holy proof that God exists. The plight of the Jewish people, how we got here, for him was nothing short of a miracle.
In 2010, the International Christian Embassy Jerusalem presented Pat with a Lifetime Achievement Award for his unwavering support for Israel.
He stood up for Israel and made that commitment to stand with this nation well before a lot of the major Christian leaders did back in the 70s. I think Israelis know that he was one of the pillars and the pioneers and patriarchs of Christian support for Israel today.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu tweeted, "He was a great friend of Israel, second to none. Over the decades, he led millions of his followers in supporting the Jewish state. I will fondly remember our many meetings together, his warmth and steadfast friendship, which stood the test of time and circumstance."
There was nobody who loved Israel in the Christian world more than Pat Robertson. I don't think anyone had more influence on the Christian world. Because Pat Robertson had built CBN from scratch, that gave him a reach. It gave him an influence that was outside, I think, any other person in the pro-Israel Christian space.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Coming up here at home, how CBN's own reporters remember Pat, what he meant to them, his love of news, and the importance of his staunch Christian faith. We're going to have that story for you when we come back. Please stay with us.
Your free copy of Protect Your Heart.
As we wrap today's special show on what leaders of all kinds have had to say about Pat Robertson, we also have a look at what CBN reporters from Virginia Beach to Israel remember about Pat and how his leadership and walk with the Lord inspired them.
Charlene Aaron grew up watching the 700 Club, never dreaming she would one day work for its host.
His heart for souls, his heart for prayer, his heart for he loves Jesus with all of his heart. That is why I wanted to work at CBN, because it's like, I want what he has.
Ephraim Graham watched as well.
There was a rule in my house when I was a kid. You could not watch television in the morning before school. The one exception was if you were watching Christian television.
Years later, after accepting a job at CBN News, he walked the campus for the first time.
And I could really clearly hear God saying to me, this is what believing in a vision looks like. This is what it looks like. This is what obedience looks like.
Pat inspired generations of reporters and producers to work at CBN and sometimes directly paved the way.
He took a chance on me almost a decade ago, advocating that I be put on air despite my youth and inexperience, which in turn allowed me to step into a calling that God had put on my heart.
When I met Pat, I told him that I thought I always wanted to work at NBC, but God called me to work at CBN, and he said, it sounds like you had a case of spiritual dyslexia.
Dale Hurd first met Pat working for another network as he covered him on the campaign trail running for president.
I remember being so impressed with his breadth of knowledge about policy issues. And that was the beginning of my coming to CBN News.
Gary Lane was his senior campaign press secretary and remembers a tough day on the trail when he asked Pat why he was running.
He said, because God has told me to do that. And he said, I can't expect Christians to get involved in the political process if I'm not willing to put myself out there and do the same.
Lane later produced for Pat after the Berlin Wall came down, encouraging him and Billy Graham to walk along the wall.
It was a very historic and touching moment as both of these great evangelists looked into East Germany and said, we're going to claim that for Jesus.
George Thomas traveled to India with Pat and remembers incredible ministry, including speaking to a crowd of 500,000 people in New Delhi.
Yeah, I'm fixing the mic and he says, pray for me. I'm nervous. And I said, sure. And I put my hand on him, on his chest, and I just prayed with him. And then a few minutes later, he goes up and gives this powerful message. And after, half an hour, 45 minutes of preaching, half the crowd give their lives to Jesus Christ. And it's a powerful moment.
Jerusalem Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell says Pat's vow to stand by Israel in the 1970s not only endured for his lifetime, but made a profound mark around the world and at CBN.
Pat kept that vow, and I believe the CBN global family has been blessed because of Pat's steadfastness and faithfulness to stand with Israel and the Jewish people.
In 2006, Wendy Griffith traveled with him to Israel to cover the war with Hezbollah.
He was fearless. I mean, he's literally, there's rockets going over us, and he's doing a live shot with Fox News. And sure enough, a Katyusha rocket whizzes overhead and explodes on the mountain behind us.
In all the CBN newsrooms from Virginia Beach to Washington, D.C., Pat's love for the news was contagious and inspiring.
He was always so up to speed and up to date on what was happening in the latest medical news.
One of the things that always struck me about Pat
was his love of the news. A great scoop, good storytelling, a compelling lead.
Many at CBN News also recall the details he remembered about their families and the times he showed up.
I'll just never forget his smile, though, at my wedding. I think he was as happy as I was, for sure. Good morning.
But perhaps Pat's biggest legacy for reporters and producers was his life of faith.
When I think about Pat, I think about how he listened to God. He was always listening to God.
When I think of Pat and his life and his legacy, I think of what the Bible calls an oak of righteousness, giving shade to generations.
I believe Pat's legacy centers on the idea of his obedience and also his audacious faith. It's what led him to do foolish things in the eyes of the world, like starting a Christian broadcasting ministry with no experience, with little support and barely any finances.
I think what he would want people to understand is that the glory and the honor belongs to the Lord Jesus Christ. He simply said yes to God.
He yielded to God, and by doing that, he allowed God to work through him in just an incredible supernatural way.
Reporter Abigail Robertson, who is also Pat's granddaughter, says this giant faith never wavered, even in his last moments.
We walked in the door, and it was really the first time that he acknowledged that he was nearing home. He was probably heading to heaven soon. And we walk in, and he goes, I've been asking the Lord, what do I need to tell them? What do I need to share with them? And he just looked at us, and he said, trust God. God is always faithful. Never, ever, ever has he failed me. Never, ever, ever has he let me down.
Heather Sells, CBN News.
Time for your Friday Faithful, and I leave you today with this thought ripped from the pages of Dr. Robertson's life. The vision God has given you isn't for you to do. It's for him to do through you. Trust him to do it. Pray, sow, put your hands to the plow, and watch him work. You are his partner in this journey, and he will do more than you could ever imagine. Well, that will do it for this edition of CBN News Watch. I want to remind you, you can always find more of our news programs on the CBN News Channel at any time or online at cbnnews.com. We'd love to know what you think about the stories you've seen here today or any day. You can email us, newswatch@cbn.com. And of course, you can always reach out and touch us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We would love to hear from you. Make this a fabulous Friday. Be sure to have yourself a wonderful weekend, and then come on back and join us right back here, same time, come Monday. Goodbye, everybody. God bless.